A savage winter wind tore across the wide-open plains, carrying the icy bite of loneliness that only an old soul might understand. Under a moon as pale as a faded photograph, a solitary cabin stood resolute against the swirling snow. Inside, a determined widow and her young twins huddled close to a dwindling fire, the only light in a sea of darkness. Yet just beyond the drifting snowbanks, five armed riders approached like ghostly silhouettes, driven by greed and a taste for blood. Among them was Malachi Ridgway, a name whispered over campfires and nursing home rec rooms, like an ex-Confederate cavalryman with a cruel streak. He believed this homestead would fall as easily as countless others. What he didn't count on was Grant Preston, a seasoned scout with true grit etched into every line on his face. The stage was set for a showdown that would test courage and faith, forging a story of loyalty, love, and hard-won survival on the rugged American frontier. The wind shrieked across the frozen plains of Montana, whipping mounds of snow into ghostly shapes under the pale moonlight. At the edge of this lonely wilderness stood a humble log cabin, so unremarkable that most travelers would pass it by without a second glance. Yet on this particular night, five mounted figures crested a nearby ridge, their silhouettes flickering in and out of focus as the wind hurled sheets of snow around them. Leading the group was Malachi Ridgway, a man whose grim countenance and scarred jaw spoke volumes about the ruthlessness lurking beneath his heavy coat. He stopped to peer at the solitary structure below. A single wisp of smoke curled from its chimney, and the faintest glow of a lantern was visible through one frost-rimmed window. Malachi sniffed at the air, tasting the winter's cruelty. "Should be easy pickings," he declared in a cold, flat voice. "A widow and her brats, if the rumors are true, no. Neighbors for miles, no one to hear a thing." His words were swallowed by the roar of the wind, but his men caught every syllable. They were a ragtag band, each hardened by years of scrapes with the law and life on the frontier. Grayson Parker shifted in his saddle, trying to keep a hand steady on the rifle slung across his back. Kincaid Davis, sporting an old limp that pained him in the cold, spat into the snow with a show of contempt. Two other men, each as sullen and silent as the howling wind, flanked Malachi's sides. None of them realized that the occupant of that cabin was not entirely defenseless. A man named Grant Preston, a former cavalry scout whose eyes were as gray as the storm clouds, overhead had arrived at the doorstep of that homestead just a short while earlier. Nearly dead from exposure, he had come seeking shelter and found far more than warmth in the hearth. Inside, Cora Hawkins and her 6-year-old twin boys, Eli and Jonah, lay exhausted from days of struggle. 2 nights past, Grant had stumbled upon Cora and her children huddled and half frozen in the deep snowdrifts a short distance from the cabin. He had helped them back to their modest home, determined to see them through the worst of the storm. Cora was a widow at 31, having lost her husband, Everett Hawkins, to a mysterious shooting 2 winters prior. She had clung to the land for as long as she could, Everett's dream of a prosperous homestead echoing in the logs and beams that formed their shelter. Yet tragedy after tragedy had chipped away at her hope. The twins, Eli and Jonah, bore that same Hawkins tenacity, but months of privation had left them with little more than the grit to survive. Grant Preston had not planned to remain with them for long, but something in Cora's resilient spirit and the children's earnest gazes had gripped him. When they heard the faint ring of distant hoofbeats out in the vast whiteness, Grant felt his instincts sharpen. He recognized the formation and the approach, sensing a deliberate encirclement. He rose from his spot near the dying embers in the hearth, quietly reaching for the rifle he had set aside earlier. Cora stood behind him, her auburn hair escaping from a loose braid where he etched across her features. Outside, the winter storm was slowing, but the new menace of Malachi Ridgway's gang was only beginning to unfold. In the face of this threat, neither Grant nor Cora knew that their brief acquaintance would be forged into something far stronger, and that before dawn, both their lives would be changed forever. The day before Malachi Ridgway's gang appeared on that ridge, Grant Preston had collapsed against Cora Hawkins's door in the midst of a raging blizzard. The sleet lashed him with ferocity, and frost had formed icicles in his dark beard. Each step had been an agonizing trial after he had lost the trail to Stone Creek, a small trading post west of Redwood Creek. By the time he spotted the dim light of Cora's chimney smoke, he could barely articulate his plea for shelter. Cora had hesitated. She had been on edge ever since Everett's death, and the isolation of their cabin forced her to be vigilant. But as soon as she saw Grant's half-frozen form, she knew she had no choice. Gathering her courage, she eased open the door, just a crack enough to point Everett's old rifle out into the swirling snow. "Are you alone?" she had asked, her voice shaking with the bitter wind. Grant's speech was slurred by the cold names Preston, ma'am. Grant Preston. "I've lost my way. Can't go on much further. My horse is near collapse." His voice trailed off as he wrestled against the urge to faint. The faint candlelight flickering behind Cora lit up the desperation in his eyes. Despite her fear, she remembered Everett's firm belief that frontier folk couldn't survive without a measure of kindness. Sliding the rifle back, she lifted the heavy wooden bar and allowed Grant inside. After that tumultuous introduction, they had settled into a wary coexistence. Grant, warmed by the fire and grateful beyond words, noticed the meager provisions and the scattering of tattered blankets that Cora doled out carefully the twins. Eli and Jonah peered at him from behind their mother's skirts, intrigued by the strange man in uniform, pants and worn cavalry boots. At first light, Grant rose to see if his horse had survived the punishing elements. He found the buckskin in the rickety stable out back, breathing painfully but alive. Yet his intention to depart as soon as possible vanished the moment he truly understood Cora's plight. She had enough firewood and dried goods to last perhaps another week, but no more. The raging storm had barricaded much of the land with drifts taller than the twins. Even if she wanted to travel to the trading post for supplies, the journey would be perilous. Grant's innate sense of duty flared. He had spent years tracking and scouting for the cavalry, forging a reputation for standing by those in need. Now faced with a determined widow and her two vulnerable boys, he felt he had stumbled into a situation where walking away would be tantamount to cruelty. By the morning of Malachi's arrival, Grant had already hauled enough firewood to keep them from immediate danger of freezing. He had also repaired the stable door, securing it against future storms. As Cora cooked a thin stew over the hearth, mixing the last of her dried vegetables and beans, Grant had taken it upon himself to scan the horizon. The creeping sense of foreboding he felt was confirmed when he spotted those 5 riders from the west. Their approach was slow, but it had that predatory patience he recognized from encounters with ruthless men. He returned to the cabin, quietly informing Cora of the incoming threat. She responded by ushering the boys into a small, concealed space between the walls that Everett had built for emergencies, an innovation meant for possible raids but never truly put to the test until now. Together, Grant and Cora braced for a confrontation, neither aware of the vicious reputation of the gang that was about to descend upon them. Malachi Ridgway had once served in a Confederate cavalry regiment where he perfected the art of stealth attacks and quick getaways. After the war, he drifted west, assembling a small band of men just desperate enough to follow his commands without question. Rumors of his ruthlessness spread in hushed whispers from one remote settlement to another. Though there was scant official evidence linking him to the murder of homesteaders, everyone seemed to know that Ridgway specialized in turning isolated families off their land, seizing the properties and selling them to unscrupulous buyers. That was precisely how Everett Hawkins had become a target. But Malachi never counted on meeting real resistance in these lonely parts, especially not from a cavalry scout who had once proven too resourceful for even the toughest assignments. As the 5 riders reined in close to the Hawkins cabin, Malachi lifted a gloved hand for silence. "Easy now," he ordered, scanning the windows for any sign of movement. "Let's see if the widow will play nice." He urged his horse a few steps forward, then called, "Hello in the house. We're travelers caught by the storm. Might you spare a little kindness?" Inside, Cora and Grant exchanged a tight-lipped glance. Cora stepped near a window, careful not to stand fully in front of it. "We can't offer much," she answered, forcing as much strength into her voice as she could muster. "Our supplies are low and my husband is away. He should be back any time with neighbors." She hoped the mention of neighbors would discourage any attempt at violence. Outside, one of Malachi's men with a patchy beard spat into the snow. He muttered something too low for Cora to hear, but Grant saw the shape of the man's posture tense, eager for a fight. Malachi rested his hand on his revolver and pretended to consider her words. "We'd be grateful for any generosity, ma'am," he said, the veneer of politeness barely masking the menace in his tone. "A little coffee, maybe a warm corner to rest these weary bones." Grant, standing behind the door, recognized the tactic of false courtesy. "We have little enough for ourselves," he replied loudly. "You'll find what you need at Stone Creek about 20 miles south." Cora's heart hammered in her chest, each thud reminding her that she was not alone in facing this threat. Grant's presence gave her a fragile sense of hope. Malachi exhaled in a show of theatrical disappointment, then signaled to his men. They split, circling the cabin at a measured pace. "Now that's not very neighborly," Malachi called again, his voice carrying on the frigid air. A widow alone in the wilderness? Surely you can spare a bit more than a few words. Grant gestured for Cora to move away from the window. He slid into position to cover any angle Malachi's men might exploit. He could sense the next step. Intimidation and effort to see if fear alone would make the cabin's occupants surrender. Cora steadied herself by gripping the rifle. She had never felt more vulnerable than at that moment, standing in the crosshairs of men who wanted not just her supplies, but possibly her life. The approaching conflict felt inevitable, a clash that would test everything she and Grant could muster to protect Eli and Jonah. As the standoff loomed, Grant Preston took stock of the cabin's defenses. The Hawkins homestead was modest, a single main room with a loft above a makeshift stable attached to the back, where two scrawny milk cows and a few chickens were kept. Everett's careful craftsmanship was apparent in the tight-fitted logs in the stone fireplace that provided the only real warmth. But for all its sturdy simplicity, the cabin wasn't designed to withstand a prolonged siege. He and Cora had mere minutes, perhaps seconds, before Malachi's gang decided to force the issue. Grant showed her how to stack furniture to create cover near the windows, turning the table on its side and propping up the old dresser behind it. Every board or piece of furniture might stop a bullet if placed correctly. He pointed out potential weak spots: the door's hinges, the thin shutters on the back window, and the vulnerable roof. If they can't breach a wall, they might try climbing up top, he warned. I've seen outlaws try to tear through the roof or smoke people out through the chimney. Cora's pulse raced as she positioned herself at one of the side windows, rifle in hand, eyes scanning the drifted snow for any sign of approach. Behind the false front of kindness, Malachi's men had begun to maneuver. Two had flanked the eastern side, and one stayed directly out front, and the remaining two circled back, possibly toward the stable. The reality of a well-coordinated attack chilled Cora almost as much as the fierce winter wind, yet she found a grim resolve within herself. Everett had once said she was tougher than any Montana winter, and right now she needed every ounce of that toughness. We can't let them burn us out, Grant murmured. Most gangs in these parts rely on fear. They don't want a prolonged fight. They'd rather intimidate folks into surrender. But Malachi Ridgway, from what I've heard, is not like most outlaws. He's methodical. Cora swallowed hard. He murdered Everett, didn't he? It was less a question than a statement. She had long suspected that Everett's so-called accidental shooting on the trail was no accident at all. Her intuition told her that Malachi or someone like him was responsible. She clutched the rifle, the memory of her husband's final days heavy on her mind. Before Grant could confirm or deny, the first shot rang out. A bullet thunked into the log wall a few feet from where he stood. In an instant, their world narrowed to the sound of gunfire and the deafening roar of the wind outside. Splinters of wood flew, and Cora crouched behind the table. Grant sidled along the opposite window, returning a warning shot that sent one of Malachi's men scrambling for cover. If you want to fight, Grant bellowed, you've found one, but you won't win it easily. His words were a gamble. He knew the gang had numbers, but he and Cora had the advantage of a defensible position for now. He hoped the outlaws might reconsider after realizing this widow was not alone and helpless. Yet each minute that passed, Malachi's men would observe, test, and find weaknesses. They needed to outlast them or find some way to break the siege. Through the swirling chaos, Cora thought of Eli and Jonah tucked away in the hidden compartment between the cabin walls. She prayed they would stay silent, as Everett had taught them to do, and that the meager logs barricading their route of escape would hold if the worst came to pass. Night settled over the valley, bringing with it a temperature drop so sharp that the air outside the cabin seemed to crackle with ice. The moonlight bathed the snow in a pale glow that offered meager visibility. Within the cabin, Grant and Cora crouched near the flickering embers of the fire, rationing the heat. They were exhausted, every sense stretched taut by the expectancy of another assault. Occasionally a shot sounded from the darkness outside, a bullet pinging off the stone fireplace, or burying itself in the logs. It was a form of psychological warfare designed to keep the defenders jumpy and awake. Grant carefully peered through a crack in the shutter. He spotted shadows moving beyond the trees, quick glimpses of figures repositioning. They're looking for a blind spot, he whispered to Cora, seeing which window we check, least often waiting for us to slip. Cora nodded, too spent to speak. She checked the rifle, counting her ammunition. The supply was dangerously low. She pressed a trembling hand against her temple, recalling Everett's lessons in marksmanship. He had insisted that she know how to handle a firearm, sure that the frontier demanded it of every soul trying to homestead. Just aim for center mass, she murmured. Remembering his steady instructions, "Don't try to be a sharpshooter." Grant caught her anxious expression. "We have to make every shot count," he agreed. "But if we can convince Malachi that reinforcements are on the way, we might avoid a prolonged fight." He paused. "Do you have any friends or neighbors who might come if they saw smoke signals or heard gunfire?" Cora shook her head. "Floyd Becker lives about 4 miles east, but he's nearly 70 and keeps to his own property. In deep winter, it's unlikely he'd travel unless he thought something was seriously wrong. Besides, how would he even know?" Grant pressed his lips into a thin line. "They were on their own. We can't let them breach the cabin," he said finally. "Nor can we let them trap us in here. If they try to set fire to the roof, we'll be forced out into the open." Outside, the wind howled again, rattling the shutters. The stable, which Grant had cleared out earlier, was their only additional haven if they could reach it. The hidden tunnel that connected the cabin to the stable had been Everett's defensive innovation, but it was only wide enough for the twins or a single adult crawling on hands and knees. In the event of a siege, Everett's plan had been for Cora and the children to escape unseen, while the intruders focused on the main door. Now Grant found himself silently thanking Everett's foresight, even as he cursed the necessity of using such tactics against fellow countrymen. A faint scraping sound overhead seized Grant's attention. "They're on the roof," he hissed. From the loft ladder, he could see tiny shavings of wood flitting down through the cracks between the rafters. "One of them is trying to dig in." Immediately, Cora moved to cover the fireplace. A determined intruder might drop through the chimney or pry loose enough shingles to open a hole. Grant grabbed a heavy iron bar from a set of tools. He climbed halfway up to the loft, pressed his ear to the ceiling, and waited. Sure enough, someone was tapping, testing the structure. With a sudden thrust, Grant drove the metal bar upward, splintering a small section of wood. He heard a yelp from above, followed by a rush of sliding snow. The would-be intruder lost his footing, crashing off the roof into a snowdrift. Heart pounding, Grant slid back down, exchanging a quick, grim nod with Cora. One threat was momentarily neutralized, but they both knew the night was far from over. The clash outside escalated when the outlaw who had fallen from the roof began hollering for help. Gunfire flared anew, bullets slamming into the cabin's exterior. Malachi Ridgway's furious voice resonated through the gloom. "Fools keep them pinned while we figure out another way in." The men scattered, moving to positions that granted them overlapping angles of fire. A bullet shattered the corner of the window shutter near Cora's shoulder, sending a spray of splinters into her hair. Grant pressed a hand to Cora's back, guiding her behind the makeshift barricade. "We need to stop them from getting close enough to set the place on fire," he said, his breath short with adrenaline. Through the small gap in the barricade, he spotted a man lugging what looked like a torch unlit. For now, the figure crept low, using piled snowdrifts for partial cover. Cora inhaled deeply, rifle at the ready. "I see him," she whispered. With Everett's rifle braced, she aligned the sights on the moving shape. Squeezing the trigger, she sent a round that struck the outlaw's arm, causing the torch to clatter into the snow. The man tumbled out of sight, howling in pain. From somewhere in the dark, Malachi let out a bark of irritated laughter. "You've got fight, I'll give you that," he shouted. "But there are 5 of us, well armed, and only 2 of you. Sooner or later, you'll run out of bullets or ways to hide." Grant steadied his grip on his Colt revolver. "We'd rather die here than let you take this land," he yelled back, partly as a bluff, partly as a vow. He glanced at Cora and caught the flicker of determination in her eyes. For her, this was personal. The homestead was Everett's legacy, and the desire to protect it was woven into her soul. The gunfire lulled for a moment, replaced by the murmuring of men conferring behind the tree line. They were likely discussing another approach. With time to breathe, Grant's mind raced. What if we could convince them there's a cavalry patrol nearby? He mused in a low voice. Or that we've sent someone to get help. Cora considered the idea. If only we could, but there's no sign of tracks leaving the property, and these men have been circling the cabin. They'd know if someone had escaped. Her face clouded with worry for Eli and Jonah, who remained tucked away in the hidden passage. A fleeting look of guilt crossed her features. She hated that they were locked in darkness while danger swirled so close by. Another round of shots rang out, though these seemed more disorganized. In the moonlight, Grant glimpsed at least one outlaw, nursing a wound, leaning heavily against a tree. Their resolve might be weakening, but Malachi was too cunning to give up. He would try something else, perhaps a ruse or a push at dawn. A sinking feeling told Grant that if the outlaws couldn't flush them out overnight, they'd attempt a larger blaze or an all-out assault in the early morning light. Cora's heart pounded so fiercely she wondered if Malachi could hear it through the walls. Yet in that moment of fear, she also felt a surge of strange comfort. She was not alone. Grant Preston was with her, steadfast and skilled, willing to do whatever it took to keep her and the twins safe. The thought offered her a spark of hope in a night that seemed endless. Midnight slipped by, the hours blending into a haze of tension and dread. Periodic gunfire kept Grant and Cora sleepless, but the outlaws hadn't managed to force an entry. Each time Malachi's men attempted a stealth approach, Grant or Cora fired carefully aimed shots, wounding rather than killing. The strategy was deliberate. An injured outlaw required attention and dragged down morale. Their bullets, however, were dwindling. Grant mentally counted each spent shell. They could not hold out forever. The mood shifted precipitously a couple of hours before dawn. The swirling wind diminished and an uneasy stillness settled over the clearing. Suddenly, a volley of gunshots came from the opposite ridge, echoing across the snowy landscape. The blast tore through the night, and one bullet whizzed so close above Malachi's position that the outlaw leader cursed and dove for cover. This new barrage didn't seem to come from the Hawkins cabin. Instead, it originated from somewhere behind Malachi's men. Malachi Ridgway. A voice boomed from the darkness, amplified by the wintry silence. "You are surrounded. Lay down your weapons." The words held the ring of authority. Cora's eyes darted to Grant's. Could it truly be the territorial marshal? Or some local vigilantes? She hadn't sent for anyone. Neither had Grant. Spread out, the unseen voice commanded. "We've got the place covered." A second rifle shot cracked through the air, striking a tree near the outlaw's position. The confusion among Malachi's men was immediate. Caught between the cabin and this unseen force on the ridge, they scattered in panic. Gunfire erupted in multiple bursts, frantic and uncoordinated. Grant and Cora exchanged astonished looks. The earlier idea of tricking Malachi into believing reinforcements had arrived was becoming a reality, except neither of them had orchestrated this. Keeping his head low, Grant peered out a shattered section of window. Squinting against the pale moonlight, he glimpsed movement on the distant ridge. At first, it looked like several figures, each spaced apart to give the illusion of a large posse. But as he focused, a suspicion formed. The shapes didn't move quite like actual men. Some were propped up on branches, hats pinned in place, rifles angled. It was an old trick used by frontier scouts to fake a bigger force. Amid the ruse, one genuine rifleman advanced firing shots that kept Malachi's gang pinned. Grant recognized the hunched form as Floyd Becker, Cora's elderly neighbor. Relief and surprise word formed in his chest. Somehow Floyd must have heard or seen the nighttime gunfire and decided to act. Though well past his prime, the old man apparently had not lost his cunning from his years on the frontier. Panicked curses came from Malachi's men. One of them, a heavy-set outlaw named Grayson Parker, bolted from cover. Hands raised, "I surrender," he yelled. Stumbling in the deep snow, Malachi promptly shot him in the back, a brutal warning that no one would desert. The shot rang out in the frigid air, a testament to Malachi's icy heart. Floyd Becker's voice thundered again. "Last chance, Ridgway! Throw down your guns!" The muzzle flashes from Floyd's vantage made it look like multiple rifles were firing at once. A bullet clipped a tree near Malachi, showering him with bark. Seeing how quickly his control was unraveling, Malachi ground his teeth in fury. He had not expected a sudden second threat from behind. "Stay down," Grant whispered to Cora. He inched toward the door, determined to press this advantage. The arrival of Floyd plus the clever deception of a non-existent posse could turn the tide decisively. "Ridgway," Grant roared, hoping to sow further panic. "Now you see that it's not just me and the widow. We've got allies, and they've got you cornered." Malachi Ridgway's anger erupted in a frenzy of curses. He snapped commands at his remaining men, only half of whom were still uninjured enough to fight. The others had taken bullets to shoulders, legs, or arms, courtesy of Cora and Grant's precise marksmanship throughout the night. While Malachi raged, a wiry outlaw named Kincaid Davis hissed back, "We're not equipped for a showdown with a full posse. There's no bounty big enough to die for." Grant saw a slender figure dart away from the cover of a pine tree attempting to flee. Another shot rang out from Floyd's direction, deliberately missing by inches but scaring the outlaw into freezing. "Don't do anything stupid." Floyd's voice carried with surprising vigor. From the cabin, Cora marveled at how Floyd, a solitary homesteader well into his 70s, was orchestrating such an effective illusion. Seizing the moment, Grant risked stepping out onto the small porch. The cold air slapped him in the face, but he kept his revolver trained. "Ridgway," he called, We have you surrender now, and we'll take you to the authorities in one piece. He had to give Malachi a path to a seemingly rational choice. Desperate men were dangerous, but they sometimes folded when given an out that spared their lives. Cora, still behind the barricade, watched intently, her rifle ready to provide cover. She saw a flash of movement in the gloom, a figure flanking Grant from the side. "Grant left," she shouted. Her voice reverberated through the biting wind. Grant whipped his pistol around, firing instinctively. The bullet tore through the snow just in front of the attacker, forcing the outlaw to dive prone. In that moment, a second shot from the ridge found its mark in the ground near the attacker's feet. Trapped between two threats, the man crawled into the open, tossing his gun aside. Amidst the chaos, Malachi Ridgway emerged from behind a spruce, gripping his revolver. In his good hand, his other arm dripped blood from an earlier wound inflicted by Cora's rifle. "You'll regret this." "Preston," Malachi snarled, half squinting against the swirl of wind and dawn's first glimmer on the horizon. "None of this land matters if you're dead, and I always settle my debts." Grant kept his revolver pointed steadily. He took a cautious step forward, enough to see Malachi's face clearly. The man's teeth were bared, the veins on his neck bulging with rage. "Killing me won't fix your predicament," Grant replied evenly. "You've got men shot and dying, an old-timer flanking you with the rifle, and the widow you tried to rob can identify you for the marshal. Game's over." "I've got enough left for one bullet," Malachi hissed. He started to raise his pistol, but a crack echoed from the cabin as Cora fired a single precise shot. The bullet slammed into Malachi's wrist, forcing his pistol to fly from his grasp. He collapsed to his knees in the snow, howling in pain and fury. Grant wasted no time. He closed the distance and kicked the pistol further away. Malachi clutched his bleeding wrists, glaring daggers at both of them. "Think you'll see me hang?" Malachi spat through clenched teeth. "I've got friends in high places. You can't win against them all." Grant ignored the threat. With a piece of leather strap he kept in his belt, he swiftly bound Malachi's hands behind his back. "Tell those friends you lost to a pair of determined defenders," he said coldly. "Now shut your mouth." The last vestiges of the night's siege dissolved as rays of early morning sun glinted on the snow. A sense of relieved exhaustion permeated the air. Floyd Becker, no longer shouting orders to his faux posse, was already trudging over to verify the damage. And inside the cabin, Cora exhaled a shaky breath, knowing the fight was finally done. With Malachi Ridgway restrained, the rest of the outlaws dropped their weapons, either clutching their injuries or too demoralized to continue. Floyd Becker stepped into the clearing, the old rifle in his arms still aimed steadily. Eyes narrowed. "Some cavalry," he drawled, looking at the battered men. Then he turned to Grant with an almost sheepish grin. "Sorry I wasn't more help earlier. Spent half the night setting up decoys on that ridge." Grant offered the older man a respectful nod. "You did more than enough," he assured. "You saved lives here, Floyd." Cora emerged cautiously from the cabin, rifle still at the ready, in case any of Malachi's men tried a last-ditch act of violence. Her heart pounded as she scanned the wreckage of the siege. Blood-stained snow, a few groaning outlaws, spent shells scattered like seeds on the ground. She thought of Everett. He had died in such a manner. An ambush on a trail, a bullet in the back. The realization that Malachi himself likely orchestrated Everett's murder lit a hot coil of anger in her chest. But with the threat ended, all that was left was a hollow ache. While Floyd kept his rifle on the group, Grant knelt to check the injuries of each outlaw, pulling away their guns. He found the one Malachi had shot in the back. A man named Grayson Parker, who was beyond saving. "Man's dead," Grant muttered, face grim. Floyd shuffled over and shook his head. "He tried to quit, and Malachi wouldn't have it," Floyd said softly, spitting into the snow. "No honor among thieves, I suppose." Malachi remained on his knees, fury smoldering in his eyes. "None of you have any idea what's coming," he sneered. "I've got property deeds, land rights, everything to prove I own this place. You're all just squatters." Cora's brow furrowed in rage, but Grant placed a calming hand on her arm. "Let him talk," he advised. "He'll have his day in court, and we'll see what the territorial judge makes of his legal documents." The mention of a lawful trial made Malachi snort with contempt, but he remained silent as Grant pulled him to his feet. The twins, Eli and Jonah, peeked from the cabin doorway, their eyes wide. They had hidden through the entire siege without making a sound, just as Everett had taught them. Seeing that it was finally safe, they rushed to Cora's side, clinging to her skirts. "Are the bad men gone?" Eli whispered. Cora knelt and wrapped her arms around both boys. "It's all right, my loves. They can't hurt us anymore." She looked up at Grant, her eyes swimming with a combination of relief, exhaustion, and deep gratitude. He nodded back, acknowledging the unspoken bond that had formed between them during the perilous night. Inside, the fire burned low, casting a gentle warmth that felt like a world removed from the violence outside. Grant guided the children away from the grisly scene, letting Cora handle the immediate aftermath of capturing Malachi. The battered gang of outlaws huddled together, some cursing, others groaning in pain. Floyd Becker, for his part, began rummaging through the men's saddlebags, presumably looking for any rope or makeshift binding. Though the dawn light promised a new day, all of them sensed a profound change had taken place. The Hawkins homestead, with its battered walls and bullet-scarred shutters, had become the site of a defining moment, one where courage, loyalty, and the determination to defend the innocent had triumphed over greed and violence. The days that followed were a whirlwind of practicalities, treating wounds, sending word to the territorial marshal about Malachi Ridgway's capture, and burying the dead in a small plot near the creek. Floyd Becker was instrumental, using his sled to make multiple trips between his property and Cora's. Word spread quickly once the storm lifted enough for travel. A deputy arrived from Stone Creek, astonished to find Malachi's gang subdued by just a widow, a former cavalry scout, and an elderly neighbor with a penchant for clever deception. Cora's initial relief at surviving the siege was soon followed by a quiet resolve. She spent her days patching bullet holes in the cabin, rechinking the logs where the outlaws' gunfire had chipped away the mortar, and mending the shredded shutters. In each methodical task, she felt Everett's presence, as though his dream for the land lived on in every board and beam she repaired. Grant, for his part, took to hunting in the surrounding woods, bringing back small game and restocking the lean pantry. He also accompanied the deputy into Stone Creek, offering a detailed statement about the attack and ensuring Malachi was transported to a more secure holding cell. The rumor was that the territorial courts would be eager to make an example of Ridgway, especially with so many eyewitness accounts and confessions tying him to multiple homestead murders, including Everett's days turned into weeks, and as the snow began to recede, the promise of spring was in the air. What had been a temporary arrangement, Grant staying on to safeguard Cora and the children, became something more natural, almost inevitable. Eli and Jonah took to following Grant whenever he went to chop wood or check the traps he set near the frozen creek. "Mr. Preston," Jonah would ask, "will you tell us more about the time you tracked that mother grizzly up near the pass?" Grant would oblige, weaving tales that left the boys wide-eyed and enthralled. Cora watched these interactions with a mixture of gratitude and a tenderness she hadn't felt in a long time. She couldn't deny the growing closeness between them all. One evening, as the fire crackled and the children lay asleep on pallets by the hearth, Cora and Grant found themselves alone at the table. Steam rose from 2 mugs of tea, the only luxury left in the cabin's stores. Grant reached across and gently took Cora's hand. "I should have asked you this 100 times before," he began quietly, his voice tinged with hesitation. "When Malachi and his men came, I found purpose again defending what mattered. But it isn't just about fighting off danger. It's about having a place to stand, people to protect. I've roamed for too long without roots, I think. I think this might be where I belong, if you'll have me." Cora felt a rush of emotion welling up. She thought of Everett's last words, the unfulfilled plans for the sawmill, and the expansions he had wanted to build. She thought of the lonely winters spent holding the homestead together with her bare hands. Now here was Grant, earnest and strong, asking to share in that burden, and perhaps to share much more. Her answer caught in her throat for a moment before she whispered, "I think Everett would have liked you. And I know Eli and Jonah do. I'd be glad to have you stay." Not long after Cora and Grant were wed, in a small ceremony at the church in Stone Creek, witnessed by Floyd Becker, a handful of traveling ranchers, and the deputy who had helped haul Malachi's men to justice, Eli and Jonah stood proudly in their neatest clothes, beaming at this new chapter of their lives. Upon returning to the cabin, it felt transformed by the promise of fresh hope. No longer just a fortress or a relic of Everett's legacy, it became a home shaped by shared love and resilience. And though the winter had tested them all, the thaw brought a sense that the future held the warmth of spring and the enduring strength of a family bound by courage and faith in one another. By the time spring breezes replaced winter's icy grip, the Hawkins homestead stood reborn, no longer scarred by bullet holes and fear. It now shimmered with fresh repairs and a sense of peace that felt earned through tears and gunpowder. Cora's boys, Eli and Jonah, tended the young chicks in the yard, while Grant Preston chopped a final stack of firewood, each swing of the axe announcing a fresh start. They had buried the past, along with Malachi Ridgway's ambitions. The territorial courts promised swift justice for those still breathing behind bars. Meanwhile, Floyd Becker, ever the wily neighbor, shared a celebratory drink with Grant on the cabin step. As Cora joined them, gentle sunlight danced across her face and a wave of gratitude filled the air. Their bond was forged in the crucible of danger, sealed by unwavering resolve. In that stillness of the frontier morning, they recognized a deeper truth. Sometimes the greatest battles lead to the sweetest victories, and no winter storm can snuff out a hopeful heart.